Hi and welcome back. In the previous sessions, you studied organizations using bureaucracy theory and decision-making theory. You can think of them as emphasizing the formal aspects of organizations, the rationality of organizations, and calling attention to elements such as rules, hierarchies, offices, formal roles, decision-making, strategies, goals, and routines, right? In this and the next session, I will focus on what is usually thought of as a more informal aspects of organizations. In this session, I will talk about culture, and in the next session, I will talk about institutions. We have already come across some of the informal aspects of organizations in earlier sessions. We learned from Merton that bureaucrats working in bureaucracy might develop some kind of group identity, right? A feeling of being part of a group which shape people's thinking and actions. People might develop values that goes beyond the rules of the bureaucratic organization. I'm sure that if you look closer, you will find more connections between the formal and the informal aspects of organizations. Actually, finding connections between different theories we cover in this course is an important part of the course. You do that in your hand-ins, you will do that in your webinar, and you will do that in the course paper. It's important to learn definitions, to understand a theory and how to use a theory, but it's also important to see connections and relations between different theories. Use the same case study and try to understand the case from different theories. And you realize that you will learn much more about the case you study. But remember to keep it simple. So let's focus on organizational culture. Cultural studies in organization theory started to get popular in the 1980s, primarily as a tool to make organizations more efficient. Consultants and managers really wanted to find tools to improve organizations and the way in which these organizations were run and led. The concept of culture, however, is borrowed from anthropologists and have been often used to explain the regularity of people's behavior in and across our societies. It's important to remember that culture is a somewhat vague and difficult concept. It's easy to let culture mean almost everything. This means that it's especially important for you to define carefully and precisely what you mean by culture. It's actually a really good habit to always be explicit with your definitions. I will focus on two different branches of culture in organization theory. The branches are different and not always compatible with each other. You can't really mix them, at least not at this stage in your development as organizational analysts. Instead, learn them as two distinct approaches to cultural analysis. This means that you might have to choose one of the branches for your analysis, since your analysis must be congruent with the assumptions of the branch you choose. The first branch of cultural studies I focus on represents a quite simple and somewhat naive view of culture. From this perspective, culture is about internalizing shared values, which are to a large extent possible for managers and consultants to change. In the previous session, we discussed bureaucracy and how managers can control workers through rules. But if employees internalize the culture, goals, ambitions of the organizations, managers don't need to set up expensive performance evaluation systems. Managers don't need to spend a lot of resources designing a strategy, rules and routines, right? If organizational members have internalized and share the values that have been defined by managers, these members don't need to be monitored. Members will monitor themselves and work independently towards the goal of the organization. The organization will earn more revenues and be more efficient and successful. This is a simple story about business culture. This branch of cultural studies portray culture as a characteristic of the organization. Sometimes an organization have a strong culture, organizational members have internalized and share the organizational values. At other times, members might be part of a strong culture, but the culture is misaligned with the organizational goals. Or the organization might have a weak organizational culture, meaning that organizational members have not internalized or the values of the organization. Culture is a variable of the organization that can be manipulated by managers, consultants, or normative-oriented researchers. Culture can be compared to other design elements of organizations, like rules, goals, strategies, number of employees, or the physical buildings of organizations. One of the most famous theories in this branch is William Uchi's theory Z. His theory proposes that organizations can increase their productivity by engaging people in the organization. Members should fully believe in and internalize the values and the goals of the organization. Members are not only bureaucrats that take on roles, members participate in their full persons. The task of the manager is to find ways to make employees or members fulfill all of their potential. Managers are supposed to create a common understanding among members, help them to internalize the values and culture of the organization. Managers should help members to reach their full potential as long as this potential is aligned with the goals of the organization. When the organization grows, it's the manager's task to secure that the culture internalized by members continues to be aligned with the goals of the organization. Managers needs to be able to formulate and communicate a vision for the future. In a way, what the manager needs to do is to manipulate the culture so that it's always aligned with the formal goals of the organization. Not so surprisingly, this view of culture became very popular among leaders and business consultants. Consultants wanted to sell their advices for success to managers in organizations. Managers wanted to portray themselves as successful leaders. In a way, the first branch of cultural studies became framed as a fix-it-all tool for organizations. If managers just changed the ways in which members or employees related to the organizational culture, they would be able to design a successful organization. Goals should be simple and easy to grasp. Employees or members were often told that they need to wear clothes with the company logo. For instance, I once worked at IKEA and we all had to wear the same uniform, even if we were working at the office without any customer interactions. The uniform was a way to signal a membership to the IKEA family, to the community, to strengthen the culture. There are a number of problems involved with this view of culture. First of all, it's a very simple theory. And just like the rational choice, it might not have so much support from empirical observation of the reality. One problem is that it's very difficult to know how to change the culture in a certain direction. It's a difficult concept to define and measure. And many studies seem to be anecdotal, based on studies of single firms and not suitable to draw any general conclusions from. So we don't have so much support for the idea that managers actually can change culture in intended ways or intended directions. And we don't have support that culture leads to better results. A related challenge is whether or not culture is homogeneous in organizations, or if there are many different types of subcultures in organizations. Perhaps an organization is made up by several departments which in turn have their own organizational culture. What about projects that are run in organizations for longer time periods? What about multinational organizations that have establishment in several different countries? Do they have one organizational culture, or do they have several types of organizational cultures? What about the national culture? Researchers still have difficulties grasping how to make informed distinctions between levels of culture, between countries, organizations, or subunits within organizations. Culture is a vague concept that is difficult to operationalize and define. Another aspect of business culture is whether or not it's morally acceptable to actively manipulate people's values to achieve higher profits. It's difficult to get away from the subtle control mechanisms that is ingrained in this branch of cultural studies. The second interpretation of culture in organization theory emphasizes culture as an expression of the organization itself. This interpretation focuses on how people in organizations, through their values and beliefs and actions, create and reproduce culture. It is a descriptive and explanatory approach where researchers are interested in developing an understanding of how culture is created and reproduced in organizations. In this branch, researchers often study culture through the in-depth study of employees' everyday organizational life. Researchers study aspects of members' work which have been internalized and taken for granted. Culture is assumed to be part of the employee's social reality. Important questions are to understand what it is that organizational members take for granted and why they do so. Organizations are seen as vessels that creates the reality for their employees. Researchers that work in this tradition often focus their studies on a variety of cultural expressions related to shared beliefs, ideas, and meanings. Symbols, language, stories, myth, and rituals, which are thought to create and shape people's behavior and thinking. Let me focus on a few of these cultural expressions. Perhaps one of the most fundamental cultural expression is represented by symbols. A common definition of a symbol is that it's some kind of sign that represents something else. When a sign is interpreted by people, it becomes a symbol and it gets a broad meaning. Focusing on symbols, some researchers might study how employees make jokes, what people do during coffee breaks, or how they are dressed. Different vocabularies used in organizations can be understood as important expressions of culture. You have probably noticed company slogans of various sorts. Slogans can be important to the extent that they can signal what the company stands for and share this signal among organizational members. Stories can also be important because they often convey values, ideas, and beliefs that held by members of the organization. They circulate in organizations and can give clues for members about how to think and act in various circumstances. The role of a myth is to offer an explanation for the origin of a phenomenon, an explanation for how things are. However, a myth includes an explanation that cannot be proven or disproven. It's this uncertainty between a proven explanation and an unproven explanation that makes it a myth. Rituals and ceremonies are often defined as symbols linked to certain type of practices. It's usually about different types of activities that express and create meaning. Artifacts are visible organizational structures or processes that can be represented by physical buildings or products. Business culture and organizations as cultures offer different possibilities for managers when it comes to controlling and managing culture. Of course, changing organizational culture might be difficult irrespective of which approach we trust and we rely on. However, it's important to remember that from the second interpretation, cultural change largely resides outside the control of the manager. Organizations are expressions of culture, and culture is thought to be really difficult to manipulate. Mats Alvesson, in his article, mentioned three broad positions on changing organizational culture. The first is that organizational culture, with the use of sufficient skills and resources, can be managed by top management. The second is that change is very difficult. There is a multitude of values and meanings and deep structures which are not so easy to shape. Members don't act predictable when managers try to change their values or beliefs. Still, change takes place, and management is a resourceful group exercising a lot of influence over the members. And therefore, we could assume that senior managers might be able to exercise a moderate influence on some of the values and meanings of members. The third view emphasizes culture as being beyond managers' control. How people create meaning in their work experiences is related to local culture, contingent upon educational background, work tasks, group belonging, and interpersonal interactions. This means that senior managers' efforts to influence members often will have limited impact. It might be reinterpreted and altered by the members. Business culture seems to be aligned with Alvesson's first view on cultural change, while organizations as culture might be more aligned with the second and the third view on cultural change. In this session, I've focused on culture, business culture, and organizations as culture. In the next session, I will focus on institutions, so see you there.